One thing I've always liked about Survivor Series 1991 is that the show had a element of freshness to it. And what I mean is Ric Flair had joined the company. Who's the real world champion? You know, you've got Bret Hart well on his way with his singles push. You've got this new kind of supernova character named The Undertaker that is really, getting himself over. LOD, even though they've been around for about a year now in the company, they still feel relatively fresh and new. And that was something that I did like about this show is that there were different things. There were new, fresher faces. It's fun to go back from the perspective of history and be able to see how things were set up and how things eventually would play out. Because I got to be honest, if you're looking at Survivor Series 1991 as kind of its own show, it really isn't all that good. I mean, I'm just calling it how I see it. Like Ric Flair's team going against Roddy Piper's team. And, they brought in Flair and kind of sent him at Piper right away. In part, I think, because it was a familiarity between Flair and Piper as friends, and they worked together and against each other in the past. Maybe it was the WWF not fully understanding for sure what they wanted to do with Flair heading into WrestleMania. They were just trying to buy time, what have you. The storyline in the feud between Flair and Piper, I thought, was pretty good. And, that helped, but this match, just like pretty much every match on this show, for the most part, was largely forgettable. I mean, like you got Sergeant Slaughter and who was he against? Like Colonel Mustafa, those two teams. Just you got Slaughter, Duggan, the Texas Tornado, and Tito Santana. Like I said, with these older shows, I guess during this time frame, even when the shows weren't that good, to see the amount of star power and the overall talent that was in those shows, that was pretty impressive. I don't know if you guys can hear me right now or not. There's something going on with my laptop that I can't figure out for the life of me. Something with the fan or whatever the case might be, and it's just causing all types of freaking problems. So hopefully I get it figured out soon. And like I said, hopefully you guys can hear me. Hopefully. One thing that was interesting about this show of note is that this was the 5th ever Survivor Series, but I believe it was the first ever Survivor Series with a one-on-one singles match. And what a one-on-one singles match, in theory, it was. It was The Undertaker taking on Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship. And I always found it interesting that they decided to mid-card this match. Here's a bright new future star on the scene in The Undertaker. Here is your man, your bread and butter, Hulk Hogan. You know you're going to involve Ric Flair in this. And you mid-carded your world title match on this show. I get that with where they were going with it as a company, that they wanted to make sure they sent the fans home happy, hence why they had LOD against the Natural Disasters, that team match, and they had LOD and Boss Man, that team win, kind of send the fans home happy. But I always kind of thought this show was a miss because, to me, when you go back and watch Survivor Series 1991, whether it's Taker and Hogan or so many of the other things on this show, what they were doing between Savage and Jake the Snake Roberts, what have you, it seemed literally like Survivor Series 1991 was being utilized as nothing more than a setup for Tuesday in Texas. I mean, they literally, when we talk about WrestleMania 27 and people will say it was the one time they sat there and threw a pay-per-view under the bus for another one, like completely and totally flat out didn't care about it and just threw it under the bus. I always say, well, what about Survivor Series 1991? It was really hard to get involved in Survivor Series 1991 and get engaged in Survivor Series 1991 and get excited about Survivor Series 1991 when the whole entire night, all you keep hearing about is Tuesday in Texas, and all it's about is trying to sell you on Tuesday in Texas. And I get that's the next show, and I get that it was coming up right around the corner. But for crying out loud, this was Survivor Series. This is one of your foundation shows. This is where big things and big matches were supposed to happen. You were maybe starting to really begin to set the table for the next year's WrestleMania. And instead, this company was more concerned with freaking sitting there and setting up Tuesday in Texas. It was terrible. And it really affected the enjoyment of the show. And the way they did Taker versus Hogan, it was so chintzy. And it was so jackass in the way that they did it. I mean, it came across like shit. That's the way I'll put it. I understand what they were going for here, and I understand that they were going to vacate the title and they were going to put it on the line at the 1992 Royal Rumble. And to be fair, if you went part through Survivor Series 1991 under the bus because you were setting up to the 1992 Royal Rumble, and what still to this day, over 2 decades later, is unanimously thought of as by far the greatest Royal Rumble match in the history of the Royal Rumble, that 92 Royal Rumble, then so be it. And maybe sometimes that's how it goes. You're not going to have every show knock it out of the park. When I go back and watch this show, you have Taker, you have Hogan. It mid-cards, and then it has that, like I said, chintzy-ass, cheap-ass finish, just so that way, come back Tuesday in Texas, here's Hogan throwing dirt in the eye, or with the ashes in the eyes of Taker, and he's winning the title back, and it was dumb. It was dumb. It was dumb that this match mid-carded the show. It was dumb not that Taker won, but that Taker won in the way that they did, because to me, what I don't understand is here's Taker. Here's somebody fresh for Hogan. Why in the fuck would you not make a full-on feud out of this? You basically have the match here at Survivor Series, the match at Tuesday in Texas. That was pretty much it. Why in the bluest of blue fucks would you not be setting up to Taker and Hogan at a WrestleMania? Like over the years, we talk about some of the great matches at WrestleMania that Taker never had, or the big matches at WrestleMania that Taker never had. And common names that are brought up are Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Sting, John Cena. Some big names. There's some big money matches that never happened. But you want to talk about big money matches that never happened at WrestleMania? How about The Undertaker versus Hulk Hogan? How could you never do that at a WrestleMania, especially during that time? Knowing that at some point in time, you might be backing off of Hogan. You might be going away from Hogan. Hogan might not be there forever. You needed to get that next generation ready. To me, this was an example of Hogan doing business to a degree, but still being Hogan and not being willing to fully, give somebody a stamp of approval, combining with they were trying to get to a point where Flair was going to win that title. And that's the other real big miss here. You've got Taker versus Hogan. And you get Flair involved. And all of this leads to Hulk Hogan versus Sid at WrestleMania 8 and Ric Flair versus Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8. Of all the people that could have had Hogan wrestle at WrestleMania 8, you could have had Taker. You could have had Flair. You could have had Savage. How about a rematch against the Ultimate Warrior? Of all the things you could have potentially done, even though I know Warrior was technically not with the company at the time, with all the matches that you could have done, all the things that you could have had happen, you decided the best course of action was to go Savage versus Flair for the title in the middle of the show, and then you're going to main event freaking Sid versus Hogan, where Papa Shango and Ultimate Warrior both come out. This is where I think the WWE, even back in 91, 92, even though they would occasionally put on a really damn good show, like you see with SummerSlam 92 and Royal Rumble 92, this is where you could start to see cracks starting to form. And this is where you could start to see the wrestling recession really beginning. Because that period of time for the business in general from 91 to 95 was doo-doo. And you kind of see that when you go back here. I mean, you had good things, like I said, happen on this show. The stuff between Jake the Snake and the Macho Man, very good. The way they were setting up to the split of the Rockers, with Marty Jannetty leading to Shawn Michaels getting accidentally eliminated, good stuff. I mean, LOD strong at the end, good stuff to me. But a lousy-ass WWF Championship match that really, frankly, didn't lead to anything anywhere near where it needed to lead to. It was just trash. And sometimes that's how it is with some of these shows. You look back at them and you're like, hey, this happened. But like I said, in terms of wrestling, you didn't really get a lot of good wrestling on the show. You did get a lot of star power. But this is a show right here that above anything else, when I watch it every time, I go back and do one of these series or I just watch it in general, or even parts and bits and pieces of it, like even Taker versus Hogan at Survivor Series, it just pisses me off because I think about what could have been. And when I look at Survivor Series 1991 and the aftermath and the months that came afterwards, I think about what could have been. And it ultimately leaves me with a bad taste in my mouth for this show.